Hey there, we're going to talk about one more thing before you get to your final fight, and that is a half-sword grip, sometimes called half-ward, or in German, Halbschwert. What is that? There are distances from my opponent at which the cutting and thrusting action of my sword would be less useful to me. That's when I'm closer than my sword's reach. In that instance, if I can shorten the length of the weapon I'm using, I can use it more in close quarters. And the way in which we do that with the same thing in our hands is to grasp the blade right in the middle of its length, right, pretty much halfway down, and use the sword at close quarters as if it were a rather long dagger. This is presupposing that I can grasp the blade here and my hand is protected, probably by a glove or something with chainmail in it. Though, honestly, if I grasp it and I'm not shifting the blade back and forth, I might still be able to manipulate it without harming myself. So let's assume a gloved hand here. I've grasped the blade right in the middle of its length. You'll notice my palm is in the same direction in this case as the direction of my handle-bearing hand, yeah? Though that can vary. This is not a technique that's illustrated necessarily in the manual we're going through right now, but it is a technique that appears in the world of sword and buckler. So how does that work? Well, in this case, I've got the buckler in my non-dominant hand, and what I'm doing is grasping the blade with my hand on the buckler. Now I can use it at close quarters, and my non-dominant hand, which is admittedly even closer to my opponent than my dominant hand, is protected by the buckler. I can also use the buckler offensively at close quarters as well. And so keeping that buckler in my palm and grasping the blade with my palms in the same direction affords me that opportunity, say, in a descending thrust from one side or the other. I can also grasp the blade up underneath its length. In this case, my palms are facing in opposite directions. I've kept my buckler-bearing hand palm up and my sword-bearing hand palm down, and I've grasped the blade, again, in the same hand that's holding the handle of the buckler. Here, I could be executing a thrust going upward into the low line, say up underneath the guard and into the ribs. You'll notice I'm executing this as my very last move, or one of my last moves in our final fight. The way I'm grasping the blade, though, is a little different from both of those things I just illustrated. In this case, I'm reaching up over the buckler's length, and I'm pointing the boss of the buckler in the direction of my opponent, which is the same as the direction of my right palm, but my buckler-bearing hand is at 90 degrees. So instead of, I'm going to take this a little closer to camera, instead of grasping the buckler hand around the blade like this, you'll notice my palms are facing in the same direction. I'm reaching over to the other side. And so right now, as I hold my sword-bearing hand palm toward my right, the hand of my buckler-bearing hand is palm down. Yeah? In this instance, what I'm doing is trying to use that half-sword grip, but also trying to keep the buckler itself between me and my opponent. And what happens is my opponent takes advantage of that. So let me go over that grip one more time. Here would be the grip I showed you first. My palms are both facing in the same direction, and I just grabbed the blade. It's not what I'm doing in the fight, however. I'm reaching over to the other side, and I'm grabbing it so that almost in this position, my palm faces me, while the sword-bearing palm faces away from me. And now I can try that descending thrust at my partner's right chest, which is the move in the fight. Now, I did try this with your version of the weapons that we're using, and there's a slight adjustment I'm going to recommend. So I'm going to go away for a second and come back and show you that at a little bit closer distance from the camera. I'm holding the same weapons you are now, and as you know, this buckler has a wonderful contoured handle which certainly makes sure that my hand stays in the right place, but it also makes things like grasping the blade of the sword right along the same length as the handle kind of tricky because it wants to slip off in either direction. So what I'm doing here is kind of using these two ridges in the buckler's handle. You know them better than I do, right? Those two little raised portions. I'm going diagonally across them with the blade of the sword and then grasping with my hand. This allows the extra reinforcement of that blade of the sword sitting right between those two ridges. You still get the look of something going perpendicularly through the buckler, but the handle in this case is not parallel to the length of the blade. Instead, it is at a slight angle. Now, if I use the grip we're using in the fight, I'm actually reaching up over the top. You can see, I think, that the buckler's handle is at a diagonal to the length of the blade. I've got my fingers worked all the way around. I can still pretty much close my hand. These weapons are pretty thick. Handles are pretty thick on the buckler. The blades are pretty thick on the sword, but I'm still able to close my hand. And then here I am in that grasp that I'm executing that last move in. As I said, this does appear in other buckler manuals from the 1400s and 1300s, just not the one we're working through. And I think it's a really eye-catching technique to throw in near the end of the fight. It also allows me to be executing something at much closer quarters and still keeping my partner safe. And as you'll see in the final fight, it works to my disadvantage ultimately in a way that's hopefully surprising. Half sword with the sword and buckler. Enjoy.